It is a winter evening in the year 1910, in a small synagogue in the German state of Hesse, and a boy of 11 stands among the men, murmuring words he no longer fully believes. Candlelight moves across the worn spines of prayer books stacked along a narrow shelf. Outside, a horse cart passes on the frozen road, its wheels the only sound in a farm town that has no idea what the coming decades will do to it. The air smells of tallow and cold stone. He is the cattle merchant's son, the one who reads too much, and no one in that room suspects that anything unusual is taking shape in him. He was born in this town in 1899. He fled Germany in 1932, less than a year before Hitler seized power. His own father died in that country a decade later. Strauss did not learn of it until after the war had ended. He would go on to teach philosophy for 4 decades at some of the most respected universities in the world, and to this day, his own students cannot agree on what he actually believed. What if the man who spent 40 years teaching philosophy never once told his students what he truly believed? Hello and welcome to The Long Shadow. This is the story of Leo Strauss. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn to lives built around a single, unrelenting question, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a comment below. It helps these stories find other curious listeners who might need them. And as you sit with this one tonight, I wonder what you would be willing to conceal if you believed the plain truth itself was dangerous to speak aloud, even to the people closest to you. Now, let us return to the story. To understand this man, we must return to where it all began, not in a lecture hall, and not in the corridors of power he was later accused of shaping from a distance, but in a small farming town in Hesse, in the final year of the 1800s, in a world that still believed itself permanent and unshakable. The world into which he was born had not yet discovered how fragile it truly was. Europe still trusted in its own continuity, in the slow, orderly succession of one ordinary year into the next. Kings sat on thrones that seemed as old as the land beneath them, and the wars that would soon unmake so much of that continent were still, for the moment, unthinkable to the people living through those quiet years. In the German countryside, Jewish communities like the one he was born into lived according to rhythms centuries old, rhythms of prayer, harvest, and small commerce, largely untouched by the intellectual storms already gathering in the university towns of Berlin, Marburg, and Vienna. Storms this boy would one day walk directly into. It was a world of certainty, the kind that does not announce itself as certainty, because no serious alternative has ever presented itself to those living inside it. Faith was not a private matter to be reasoned about at length over dinner. It was simply the ground one stood on, without needing to ask why the ground happened to be there at all. Few people in that small Hessian town had any reason to suspect that one of their own children would grow up to question that ground more thoroughly than almost anyone of his generation, and that the questioning would outlive him by more than a century, still unsettled long after every person in that synagogue had died. He was, in every visible way, a child of tradition, indistinguishable from the other children of Kirchhain who prayed the same words and expected, without much reflection, the same modest futures. And yet somewhere beneath that inherited certainty, something else was already stirring. Something that would not let him rest comfortably in the answers he had simply been handed. That restlessness had no name yet, and no one watching him that evening could have named it either. It would take years, and a great deal of solitude, before he understood what exactly it was asking of him. But it had already begun, quietly, unannounced, in a boy no one in that room had any particular reason to watch closely. And the ordinary family that had produced him, a family of trade and habit rather than books, was about to produce a mind that no ordinary explanation would ever quite be able to contain. In a modest house near the centre of Kirchhain, a merchant counts coins by lamplight while his son sits nearby with a book, entirely uninterested in the ledger open on the table between them. The lamp gutters slightly with each draught from the door. Outside, the smell of the cattle yards drifts faintly through the shutters, a smell the boy has grown up with and never once found interesting, no matter how often his father has tried to make it so. Leo Strauss was born in Kirchhain in 1899, the son of a cattle dealer whose trade had sustained the family for a generation before him, and would, in the ordinary run of things, have been expected to sustain the next. It was a life built on practical exchange, livestock counted and inspected in the yard, prices argued over in the marketplace, deals sealed with a handshake rather than a signature on paper. The household observed Jewish tradition with the unquestioning consistency typical of small-town life in that region, ritual and prayer woven into the ordinary hours of the week, rather than set apart from them as something separate, occasional, or optional. There was nothing in his surroundings to suggest an unusual mind was quietly forming just beneath the surface. Kirchhain was a farming town, like 100 others scattered across Hesse, its economy built on cattle and crops, its horizons defined by the fields surrounding it, and the modest synagogue standing at its center, unremarkable in every visible respect. The elder Strauss expected, as most fathers of his position and era reasonably did, that his children would continue in some version of the family's practical trade, or failing that, would find a respectable and equally unremarkable place within the existing order of provincial German life, a life measured in seasons and livestock rather than ideas. His son showed little interest in cattle, in commerce, or in the practical arithmetic that ran the family business from one season to the next. What interested him instead were books, an appetite that had no obvious use in a household built around trade and physical labor, and no clear place in the future his father had quietly assumed for him. It was not defiance, at least not at first, and it was never announced as rebellion in any dramatic way. It was something closer to a quiet mismatch between the boy's inclinations and the world that had produced him, a mismatch his family noticed without quite knowing how to name it, or what, if anything, ought to be done about it. He was the son of a man who dealt in visible, countable things, animals weighed and priced by the head, contracts settled in an afternoon. He would grow into a man obsessed with the things that could never be counted at all: truth, meaning, the proper way for a human being to live among others. That gap between father and son was not a rebellion so much as a slow divergence, unspoken across the dinner table, the kind of quiet drift that reveals itself only in hindsight, once enough years have passed to see the full shape of it clearly, long after the choice has already been made without either of them fully deciding it. By every visible measure, he was an unremarkable child in an unremarkable farming town, one more boy expected to inherit a trade he had no feeling for. But something in him had already begun to doubt what the town assumed without question, and doubt, once it takes root in a mind built for rigor rather than comfort, does not stay quietly contained for very long. A teenage boy reads by candlelight long after his family has gone to sleep, a worn copy of Nietzsche held close enough to the flame that the pages nearly scorch at the edges. The house is silent, except for the occasional creak of settling wood, and he reads as though the silence itself depends on his not being discovered. By his early teenage years, Strauss had begun reading philosophy in secret, drawn first to Nietzsche and then to Schopenhauer, thinkers whose skepticism toward inherited religious certainty gave him a vocabulary for feelings he had not yet been able to name aloud, even to himself, let alone to the family downstairs. The effect was not gradual, arriving in small doubts over many years. It arrived, by his own later account, closer to a rupture than a slow erosion, a single sustained recognition that the ground he had always stood on was not as solid as it had appeared. The unquestioned faith of his household, the prayers he had recited since early childhood, without ever examining their underlying claims, began to look to him less like truth and more like inheritance, something handed down through generations rather than something independently reasoned or proven. For a young man raised in an orthodox household, the loss of belief was not a small or private matter that could simply be set aside and managed quietly. It meant standing apart, at least inwardly, from the very community that had shaped every rhythm of his early life, continuing to observe its rituals outwardly, attending synagogue, keeping the calendar of holy days, while privately, no longer certain what, if anything, stood behind any of it. Alongside this quiet crisis of faith came a brief and genuinely serious attraction to Zionism, then gathering strength among young Jewish intellectuals across Germany. offering a different kind of answer entirely. Not religious certainty, but national purpose, a secular framework for meaning that did not require belief in revelation at all, only conviction and will. He had lost the faith he was raised in. He had not yet found anything solid enough to take its place, and the search for a replacement would not resolve itself quickly or easily. This was the beginning of a tension that would occupy him for the rest of his life without ever fully resolving, the question of whether human beings could live well by reason alone, or whether some form of revealed truth, however uncomfortable it might be to rationalize in a modern age, was necessary for any life and any society to hold together over time without collapsing into something worse. It was not an abstract puzzle to him, the kind debated at a comfortable distance in a university seminar. It was personal, urgent, and at 17, entirely unresolved, closer to a wound than a topic of study. He had lost his faith. He had not yet found what would replace it, and the search for that replacement would occupy nearly every year that followed, in ways he could not yet imagine from that candle-lit room, with a borrowed book and a family asleep down the hall. A young man walks alone through fields outside Kirchhain at dusk, the light fading toward violet at the edge of the horizon, arguing silently with himself in a conversation that goes nowhere and refuses, stubbornly, to stop, no matter how far he walks or how late the hour grows. By the time he left for university, Strauss had arrived, without any formal training to guide him, at the question that would define his entire intellectual life. Can human beings live by reason alone, or do they require something reason cannot supply on its own, a revealed truth, a faith, an authority beyond argument, in order to know how to live and how to order a common life together with others? It was a question he had inherited from no particular teacher, no book assigned to him, no lecture he had sat through. It had grown out of his own experience, out of a household of unquestioned faith giving way, in him alone among his family, to a doubt no one around him seemed to share or even fully notice. He carried this question the way other young men of his background carried ambitions of trade or profession, as something that would quietly determine the shape of everything else in his life, whether he recognized it yet or not. It was not a topic he studied from a comfortable intellectual distance, the way one might study a dead language. It was closer to an unresolved wound, one that formal education, he already suspected, would sharpen considerably rather than heal outright. He understood, even before he possessed the philosophical vocabulary to say so clearly and precisely, that this was not a question with a tidy or final answer waiting somewhere to be discovered, and that anyone who claimed otherwise, with real confidence, was probably lying, either to the people listening to them or, more troublingly, to themselves. He was still, in the eyes of his family and his town, simply a bright and somewhat withdrawn young man preparing to leave for further study. Nothing more unusual than that, nothing that would have troubled his father particularly. Inside, he was already carrying the central argument of a career that had not yet properly begun, and would not begin in earnest for years still, through faculties and cities he could not yet picture. It was a question he would spend the rest of his life trying, and largely failing, to answer completely. It would take him to some of the most demanding philosophy faculties in all of Germany, and from there, eventually, to conclusions that would unsettle even the teachers who had first shaped his thinking and given him the tools to ask the question at all. In a lecture hall in Marburg, chalk dust drifting through a shaft of afternoon light, a young Strauss takes notes with a discipline that borders on devotion, filling page after page in a hand grown increasingly precise with each passing term. At Marburg, Strauss encountered the neo-Kantian philosophy associated with Hermann Cohen, a tradition built on an almost absolute confidence in reason's capacity to ground ethics, science, and human dignity without any appeal whatsoever to revealed religion. It was, in its way, the exact opposite pole from the household he had grown up in, not faith without question, but reason without any apparent limit at all, a system that promised certainty through argument alone. For a young man still wrestling privately with the collapse of his inherited belief, this rigorous rationalism offered something that at least resembled solid ground beneath his feet again, after several years of feeling none. He absorbed the method thoroughly, more thoroughly than most of his fellow students seemed willing or able to. Marburg trained its philosophers to distrust sentiment as a guide to truth, to demand rigorous logical justification for every claim advanced, however small, and to treat philosophy as something closer to mathematics than to poetry or persuasion. Strauss proved himself capable within this exacting tradition, precise in argument, unsparing in analysis, unwilling to accept a conclusion simply because it happened to be comforting or convenient to believe. It was a training that would remain visible in his prose for the rest of his career, long after he had come to seriously doubt the tradition that had first produced this discipline in him. Marburg in those years was not simply a place of instruction, it was a kind of intellectual monastery, small and provincial in appearance, but fiercely serious about the questions it took up, and Strauss threw himself into that seriousness with the same intensity he had once brought to reading Nietzsche in secret. Cohen himself had died only shortly before Strauss's most intensive period of study there, but his influence still governed the school's approach entirely, an approach that treated Kant's critical philosophy as the final word on how reason could ground both knowledge and morality without recourse to anything beyond itself. Strauss's teachers expected total command of the primary texts, sentence by sentence, and demanded that any interpretation be defended against every plausible objection before it could be considered settled. For a time, this discipline felt to Strauss like an answer in itself, or at least like the beginning of one. If reason, applied with sufficient rigor, could ground ethics and knowledge without appeal to revelation, then perhaps the faith he had lost as a teenager was simply unnecessary, an inheritance he could set aside without any real cost to how a human life ought to be lived. It was a tempting conclusion, and for a while he allowed himself to hold it, testing it against every argument he could construct or recall from his reading. He had been taught, in effect, that reason could answer any question genuinely worth asking, provided one applied enough patience and enough rigor to the task. He had not yet been forced to consider what happened if reason, examined closely enough and honestly enough, could not even secure its own foundations, could not justify its own confidence in itself. That confrontation was closer than he knew, and it would not come from within the Marburg tradition at all. It would arrive not through a book assigned in a seminar, but through a lecture hall in another city entirely, and a philosopher barely older than Strauss himself, whose ideas would unsettle him more thoroughly than anything he had encountered since the night he first lost his faith reading by candlelight. He had been trained to trust reason completely, without reservation or hesitation. He was about to meet two men whose ideas would make that trust impossible to hold on to, without serious and painful revision, a revision that would take years to work through fully. In a crowded lecture room in Freiburg, students lean forward as a young philosopher named Martin Heidegger speaks, his delivery quiet, almost understated, but somehow unbearable to look away from once it begins, holding the room in a way none of them can quite explain afterward. Strauss traveled to Freiburg to study under Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, a demanding method that promised to return philosophy to the careful description of experience itself, stripped as far as possible of inherited assumption and unexamined habit. It was technical, exacting work, and Strauss engaged with it seriously and at considerable length, filling notebooks with careful commentary. But it was not Husserl who left the deepest mark on him during those years in Freiburg. It was Heidegger, then a young and still largely unknown lecturer, whose radical questioning of the entire history of Western philosophy struck Strauss as something closer to an earthquake than a conventional academic argument. Heidegger did not simply propose new answers to old and familiar questions. He suggested, with unsettling confidence, that philosophy since Plato had been asking the wrong questions altogether, that something essential about the nature of being itself had been lost or quietly covered over by centuries of increasingly confident and increasingly hollow rationalism. For a student trained at Marburg to trust reason as the highest available court of appeal, this was close to devastating to witness firsthand, sitting in that crowded room. Strauss later described the experience of hearing Heidegger lecture as revealing that the Neo-Kantian tradition he had studied so carefully at Marburg was, in Heidegger's presence, exposed as thin, almost brittle by comparison, a system built on sand rather than stone. What made Heidegger's lectures so unsettling was not simply the content of his arguments, which were difficult enough on their own terms, but the manner of his questioning, a manner that refused to take anything for granted, including the very framework within which philosophy had operated since the Greeks. Students who had come to Freiburg, expecting a continuation of familiar academic method, found themselves instead confronted with a wholesale demand to reconsider what philosophy was even for. Strauss, who had spent years mastering the Neo-Kantian method at Marburg precisely because it promised certainty, now found himself watching that same certainty come apart in real time, in a lecture hall delivered by a man not much older than himself. He did not abandon reason entirely in response to this, and he never would, but he could no longer treat it as self-sufficient in the way Marburg had trained him to believe. Something had to account for the fact that reason, however rigorously applied, seemed unable to justify its own starting points without quietly borrowing confidence from somewhere outside itself. This was not a comfortable realization to sit with, and it would not resolve itself in Freiburg or in the years immediately following. He had arrived in Freiburg confident in the intellectual tools reason had given him at Marburg, tools he had spent years sharpening. He left considerably less certain whether those tools were adequate to the questions he most wanted answered, questions that had followed him since adolescence. This was not a comfortable uncertainty to sit with, and it did not resolve quickly. It would take him years and an entirely different intellectual direction to work through what Heidegger had unsettled in him, a direction that would eventually lead him away from modern philosophy altogether and toward the ancient world he would later make the central study of his life. If the most compelling philosophical mind of his generation could find modern philosophy hollow at its very foundations, Strauss had to ask himself a harder question still, one that would not leave him alone for years afterward. Had reason itself simply failed as a guide to human life, or had something essential been lost somewhere along the way? Something that might still be recovered rather than replaced entirely by something new. In a smoke-filled meeting room in Frankfurt, a circle of young Jewish intellectuals argue late into the night about the future of their people, voices rising and falling over the same unresolved questions, the same arguments returning in slightly different form each time. During these same years, Strauss remained seriously engaged with political Zionism, drawn to it as a possible answer to the question that religious faith could no longer settle for him, no matter how he tried to force the old certainties back into place. If revealed truth could not be relied upon as a foundation for a life, perhaps a shared national purpose, rooted not in supernatural claims but in collective identity and self-determination, could provide the coherent framework that his lost faith had once provided without any effort at all. He argued these positions with the same intensity he brought to his philosophical reading, treating the question of a Jewish homeland as inseparable from the larger question of how any people could organize itself around genuine conviction rather than merely inherited habit and unexamined custom. The Zionist circles Strauss moved through in these years were not uniform in their thinking, and the arguments he took part in ranged from the practical question of settlement and organization to the far more abstract question of what exactly a secular Jewish nationalism could offer in place of the religious framework it was implicitly replacing. Strauss engaged these debates with genuine seriousness, unwilling to treat the movement as merely a political convenience or a reaction to circumstance. He wanted to know whether it could actually bear the philosophical weight being placed on it, whether a people could sustain itself, generation after generation, on shared history and purpose alone, without any deeper account of why that purpose mattered. Over time, his engagement cooled, not from indifference to the cause itself, which he continued to respect, but from a growing sense that Zionism, however serious a political project in its own right, could not answer the deeper philosophical question he continued to carry with him into every meeting. A national homeland might solve a pressing and legitimate political problem. It could not, on its own, resolve the tension between reason and revelation that had occupied him since adolescence. A tension no political arrangement, however just or well-intentioned, could fully dissolve through legislation or settlement. Politics, he began to conclude during these long debates, operated on a different plane from philosophy entirely, one concerned with the possible and the practical rather than with ultimate and unchanging truth. He had looked for the answer in politics and found only another question waiting patiently beneath it, one about the proper relationship between the philosopher and the political community he lives within and depends upon, a question that would return to him, transformed almost beyond recognition, decades later, in an entirely different country and context. Politics, he decided, could not solve the problem that philosophy had created in him years earlier. The search would have to continue elsewhere, in the university faculties and quiet library reading rooms where he had always felt most genuinely and completely at home. At a library desk buried in papers, a young scholar sits surrounded by the collected works of Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, his handwriting cramped into the margins of a borrowed and heavily worn edition, ink smudged where his hand has rested too long. Strauss completed his doctoral dissertation under the supervision of Ernst Cassirer, examining the epistemology of Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, a philosopher preoccupied above all else with the limits of what reason could actually prove with genuine certainty. It was careful, technical scholarship, exactly the kind expected of any serious doctoral candidate at the time, and it earned him his degree without particular controversy attached to it, a quiet academic achievement rather than a public event. But the choice of subject was not incidental to everything that had come before it in his own life. Jacobi's central concern, whether reason alone could ever ground genuine certainty about the most important matters of human existence, or whether some form of faith was unavoidable even for the most rigorous thinker imaginable, was Strauss's own private concern wearing careful scholarly disguise. Cassirer, who supervised the work, was himself among the last great representatives of the Marburg tradition, and his guidance gave Strauss's early scholarship a rigor that would mark everything he wrote for the rest of his life, even after he had moved decisively away from Cassirer's own philosophical commitments. The dissertation examined Jacobi's argument that reason, followed to its logical end, could not avoid a kind of nihilism unless it accepted some ultimate truth on faith rather than proof, a claim that must have struck Strauss, reading it as a young man still working through his own crisis, with an uncomfortable and immediate familiarity. He wrote carefully, methodically, testing each of Jacobi's claims against the standards of argument Marburg had trained into him. It was not a personal confession disguised as scholarship, though it circled, with considerable precision, around the exact question that had occupied him since he first stopped believing in the prayers of his childhood. The examiners who reviewed it saw a promising young philosopher demonstrating technical mastery, and nothing more. He now held a doctorate from one of Germany's most respected universities, a credential few in Kirchhain could have imagined for the cattle dealer's son. He still did not have an answer to the question that had driven him there in the first place, years earlier, and the years immediately ahead would offer him fewer certainties still, not more, as the world around him began to change in ways no dissertation, however carefully argued, could have anticipated or prepared him for. A letter arrives at a modest Berlin apartment, the handwriting unfamiliar, the signature beneath it belonging to a rising legal theorist named Carl Schmitt, a name Strauss recognizes at once, but has never expected to see addressed to him personally, in his own hand. By the early 1930s, Strauss had written a serious and searching critical engagement with the work of Carl Schmitt, a jurist whose theories of political authority were becoming increasingly aligned with the nationalist right then, gaining considerable strength across Germany with each passing month. It would have been entirely reasonable to expect nothing further from that exchange but professional distance, given how far apart their politics stood from one another on almost every visible point. Instead, Schmitt did something history would remember as one of the stranger and more uncomfortable footnotes of the entire period. He helped secure Strauss a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship, support that would ultimately make it possible for Strauss to leave Germany before the very worst of what was coming had fully arrived at the door. Why would a man whose legal theories would soon serve an authoritarian regime go out of his way to help a Jewish philosopher whose fundamental convictions he did not share and had, in fact, already publicly criticized in print? The historical record offers no simple motive here, no private confession that survives, no letter that settles the question cleanly, one way or another, for the historians who would later comb through it. What is documented, without serious dispute among those historians, is the fact itself. Schmidt's support was real, and its consequences for Strauss's eventual survival were significant, arriving at precisely the moment such support mattered most for a man with few other options left to him. By the time this letter arrived, Strauss had already spent years building a modest scholarly reputation in Berlin, working on studies of Spinoza and the broader question of religious skepticism within Jewish thought, work that had brought him into contact with a wide circle of German intellectual life, even as that life grew steadily more dangerous for anyone of his background. His critical essay on Schmidt had been written as serious philosophical engagement, not as flattery or courtship of a man whose political sympathies were already, by that point, becoming difficult to ignore or excuse. That Schmidt would respond to such a critique not with hostility but with practical assistance was, on its face, almost impossible to reconcile with everything else known about the man and the movement he was aligning himself with. Some historians have suggested that Schmidt respected serious intellectual opposition more than he respected uncritical agreement, and that Strauss's critique, however unwelcome its conclusions, demonstrated exactly the kind of rigorous engagement Schmidt valued in a reader. Others have simply noted that the fellowship served Schmidt's own interests in some way, now lost to the record. Neither explanation fully satisfies, and neither is likely to, given how little of the correspondence and motive behind it has survived in any complete form. It sat uneasily beside everything else true about Schmidt's political trajectory in those same years, a trajectory that would only darken further as the decade wore on. It would remain uneasy for anyone attempting, afterward, to draw a clean and satisfying moral line through the story from beginning to end. Some acts of decency, it seemed, could exist quite apart from the beliefs of the person performing them, a possibility that unsettled easy judgment in either direction, refusing to resolve into simple villainy or simple virtue. The man who would help construct the intellectual justification for authoritarian rule had just made it possible for a Jewish philosopher to escape the very country his politics were helping to poison from within, month by month. It was not the kind of contradiction the era liked to acknowledge openly at the time, and it would not be resolved simply by pretending, later, that it made straightforward moral sense. In a rented room near the Latin Quarter in Paris, Strauss sits at a small desk late into the evening, drafting a response to Schmidt's most influential book, even as his benefactor's political alignment darkens further with each passing month back home. Strauss's engagement with Schmidt did not end with simple gratitude for the fellowship that had made his escape possible. He wrote a detailed critical commentary on Schmidt's The Concept of the Political, addressing Schmidt's central argument that political life was defined, at its very core, by the sharp and irreducible distinction between friend and enemy. Strauss's critique was precise enough and searching enough in its logic that Schmidt himself later revised elements of his own thinking in direct response to it, an unusual outcome for a critique written by a scholar with so much less institutional power and public standing than the man he was criticizing so carefully and so thoroughly. The critique revealed something essential about how Strauss approached ideas in general, a habit of mind that would come to define his entire career from this point forward. He did not dismiss an argument simply because of who happened to make it, or because its author's politics were personally repellent to him, as Schmidt's increasingly were. He engaged with the argument strictly on its own terms, tested its internal logic point by point with total seriousness, and exposed its weaknesses through careful, patient reading rather than through moral denunciation delivered from a safe and comfortable distance. It was a method he would use for the remainder of his working life, applied later to figures far more celebrated than Schmidt ever was, and it demanded a kind of intellectual honesty that did not always sit comfortably alongside his own personal circumstances and debts. The specific weakness Strauss identified in Schmidt's argument concerned the very foundation on which Schmidt had built his entire theory of the political, the claim that the distinction between friend and enemy was the ultimate and irreducible category of political life, prior to and more basic than any moral or religious framework. Strauss pointed out, with careful and unhurried argument, that Schmidt's own position quietly depended on assumptions he never fully examined, assumptions drawn from precisely the older philosophical tradition Schmidt claimed to be moving beyond. It was the kind of criticism that could not simply be dismissed as ideological hostility, because it engaged Schmidt entirely on the terms Schmidt himself had set. This was, in miniature, the method Strauss would refine for the rest of his scholarly life. Take an argument with total seriousness, follow its logic more consistently than its own author had, and let the argument's internal tensions do the work of critique rather than external condemnation. It was a method that demanded patience and a willingness to spend real time inside ideas one found personally objectionable, a discipline not every scholar of the period was willing or able to sustain, particularly toward a man whose politics were becoming so plainly dangerous. Here lies the resolution of that earlier mystery, or at least as much resolution as the historical record allows anyone to reach. Strauss had accepted crucial help from a man whose politics he found genuinely dangerous and had said so plainly in print, and he had then used that same man's own words, examined with unsparing rigor, to defeat him on paper rather than in the political arena. Gratitude and disagreement, it turned out, could occupy the very same relationship without cancelling one another out entirely, an uncomfortable lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life, long after Schmidt's name had become synonymous with something far darker than legal theory. He had used Schmidt's help to leave Germany, and Schmidt's own arguments to dismantle his thinking from within, point by careful point. It would not be the last time loyalty and disagreement lived side by side in Strauss's story, without resolving cleanly into one or the other, and the years just ahead would test that same uneasy balance in far more personal and urgent terms than any philosophical essay, however sharp, could ever fully capture on the page. In a small apartment near the Latin Quarter, a young couple arranges second-hand furniture in rooms too narrow for the books already crowding every available wall, the moving boxes still half unpacked in the corner weeks after arriving. In 1932, with his Rockefeller Fellowship secured, Strauss left Germany for Paris, a departure that predated Hitler's rise to the chancellorship by only months, but that already carried, even then, the unmistakable weight of an ending rather than a simple relocation for professional reasons. He married Miriam Berntsen around this time, and the two began building a life together in conditions far more precarious than either had previously known in their more settled years in Germany, a life defined less by academic prestige than by the ordinary and grinding difficulties of statelessness, uncertain income from month to month, temporary lodgings, and a growing awareness that Germany, the country of his birth and his entire education, might no longer be a place he could safely return to at all, even to visit. Together they navigated a Paris crowded with other displaced scholars and writers, a temporary community bound less by shared background than by shared uncertainty about where any of them would eventually settle. Evenings were spent among other émigrés in similar circumstances, comparing rumors about which countries still granted visas and which universities might have room for one more refugee scholar on their faculty. The fellowship gave him time to write and think without immediate financial catastrophe hanging over him, but it did not give him permanence, and both of them understood this plainly, even as they settled into the small rhythms of their new life together. Paris was a way station, not a destination, and Strauss understood this without needing to be told, watching other émigrés pass through the same neighborhood with the same uncertain plans. He continued his scholarly work throughout this period, including the critique of Schmidt, even as the political situation in the country he had left behind grew visibly more dangerous by the month, each newspaper bringing some fresh reason for concern that could not simply be set aside. For the first time in his life, the question that had once seemed purely philosophical to him whether reason alone could sustain a human life, took on an unmistakably practical and pressing dimension it had never carried before. Reason alone could not secure a visa, or a permanent teaching position, or a country genuinely willing to have him and the family he was now responsible for. He had escaped Germany. He had not yet escaped uncertainty, and the years immediately ahead would demand a kind of endurance that no amount of philosophical training at Marburg or Freiburg could possibly have prepared him for in advance, whatever else those years had given him. In a Paris café, Strauss unfolds a newspaper at a small corner table, its headlines announcing the consolidation of Hitler's power in the country he had so recently left behind, the coffee in front of him going slowly cold as he reads. Through the middle years of the 1930s, Strauss watched from abroad as the Germany he had grown up in was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something he could barely recognize from one year to the next. The universities that had trained him, the intellectual culture at Marburg and Freiburg that had shaped his earliest and most formative questions, were being purged of Jewish scholars and reorganized around a politics that treated men like him as enemies of the state by simple definition, regardless of any individual's actual beliefs, loyalty, or conduct. Correspondence from former colleagues and distant family members carried, beneath its ordinary and carefully worded details, a steadily rising undertone of genuine alarm that grew harder to explain away with each passing season and each new law. The purges reached deep into the institutions Strauss had known personally. Faculties that had once counted distinguished Jewish scholars among their most respected members were reorganized within a matter of months. Degrees and appointments that had taken decades to earn stripped away by decree rather than by any failure of scholarship. Strauss followed these developments as closely as distance and unreliable mail allowed, piecing together from fragments of news and second-hand report a picture of a country dismantling, with methodical thoroughness, the very intellectual world that had shaped him from adolescence onward. There was no comfortable distance from any of this, even sitting at a café table in Paris, with an ocean of newsprint between him and the events themselves. Every piece of news arriving from Germany came freighted with a question Strauss could not answer from where he sat. How much worse would conditions become, and how many of the people he had once known personally, taught alongside, or studied under, would still be safe by the time any real answer finally arrived? His own position remained tenuous throughout this period, dependent on fellowships and temporary appointments that could end without much warning, even as the country that had produced him grew steadily more openly hostile to everyone who shared his background and origins, scholar or otherwise. He did not yet know the full scale of what was coming, and no one reading a Paris newspaper in the middle of that decade could have known it with any certainty. What he could see clearly enough was the direction of travel, and the direction gave him no comfort. Each new law, each new report from a former colleague, confirmed that whatever future existed for him now lay somewhere other than the country of his birth, however painful that recognition remained. Every letter from home now carried the same unspoken question beneath its careful, deliberately ordinary lines. How much longer could any of this possibly hold together? And what exactly would be left of the world he had once known, once it finally broke apart completely and for good? In a lecture hall at Cambridge, Strauss delivers a talk to a half-attentive audience on a grey afternoon, his English careful, but still visibly unpolished, his position at the university temporary and by no means guaranteed to continue past the current term. Strauss spent a period in England attempting to secure a more permanent academic position, lecturing where opportunities allowed, and relying on the hospitality of an academic community that was, at best, cautiously welcoming to the growing number of displaced European scholars arriving on its shores in those uncertain years. The work itself was real and substantial, engaging serious students and serious colleagues, but the security surrounding it was not real in the same way. Positions remained stubbornly temporary, funding uncertain from one term to the next, and Strauss, now approaching middle age with a young family depending entirely on him, felt the weight of this instability more heavily than he had as a younger, less encumbered man arriving alone in Paris. The academic culture he encountered in England operated by rhythms and assumptions unfamiliar to a scholar trained entirely within the German university system, and Strauss found himself, more than once, explaining not just his ideas, but the entire intellectual tradition that had produced them, to audiences encountering that tradition for the first time. It was demanding work in a different sense than the scholarship itself had ever been demanding. Where Marburg and Freiburg had asked him to master a body of thought already shared with his listeners, England asked him to translate an entire world of reference into terms an unfamiliar audience could follow, without the luxury of shorthand or assumed context. He managed this translation competently, by every surviving account, but competence was not the same as belonging, and Strauss understood the difference keenly, even as he continued teaching. Each lecture secured him a little more standing, a little more visibility among English academics, who might, in time, offer something more permanent. But time was precisely what felt in short supply, both for Strauss personally and for the wider situation unfolding across the Channel with each passing month. England offered him genuine safety from the immediate political danger consuming continental Europe at that moment, a real and not inconsiderable gift, given everything happening across the Channel in those same years. It did not offer him, however, the kind of settled institutional home a scholar of his seriousness and ambition genuinely needed in order to do his most demanding and lasting work without constant interruption. England had given him shelter when he badly needed it, and for that alone he remained grateful. It had not given him a future he could reasonably count on, and by the middle of the decade it had become increasingly clear that if a lasting home existed for him anywhere in the world, it would not be found on that side of the Atlantic Ocean. Strauss stands at the rail of a ship, the fog over the harbour thinning just enough to reveal the outline of New York's skyline rising ahead of him for the very first time, the deck cold and damp beneath his hands. In 1937, Strauss emigrated to the United States, taking a research fellowship at Columbia University in New York. The following year, he joined the faculty of the New School for Social Research, an institution that had become, almost by necessity, a genuine refuge for European scholars displaced by the very regime Strauss had watched consolidate its power, first from Paris and then from England over the preceding years. For the first time since leaving Germany 5 years earlier, he had something resembling real institutional stability, a faculty position, a steady salary, and a country willing not merely to tolerate his presence, but to make active use of his considerable learning and years of careful training. The new school had been built, in significant part, precisely for scholars in Strauss's position, a university in exile assembled by American academics who understood that European fascism was producing an unprecedented displacement of serious intellectual talent that might otherwise be lost entirely to the professions that had trained it. Strauss arrived to find colleagues who shared not only his displacement, but, in many cases, the same universities, the same teachers, and the same intellectual formation he had received in Germany, a strange and partial recreation of a world that no longer existed in the place it had come from. It was not, by any means, a triumphant arrival marked by celebration or fanfare of any kind. It was, more accurately, a relief so long deferred that it had nearly stopped feeling possible to him during the worst of the preceding years of temporary fellowships and uncertain visas. The years of constant private calculation about where safety might next be found were, for the moment at least, finally over, and he allowed himself, cautiously, to believe it. The adjustment was not effortless. English remained, for some time yet, a language of careful construction rather than natural fluency for him, and the American academic culture he now found himself inside operated by different assumptions than either Germany or England had. But the fundamental fact of his situation had changed in a way that mattered more than any of these adjustments. He now had time and relative security in which to think, and after 5 years of displacement, that alone represented something close to abundance. And so the question finds its answer, at least in its most basic and immediate form. He had found a country willing to give him shelter, even if he had not yet found the audience his life's work would eventually require, and, in time, richly deserve. That audience, when it finally came, would arrive slowly, built one seminar room at a time, over many patient years of teaching. In a modest seminar room in Manhattan, Strauss teaches a small circle of fellow émigrés and curious American students, testing arguments that had been quietly forming in him since his earliest years in Marburg and Freiburg, arguments he had not yet dared to state in their final form. At the new school, Strauss found something he had not had consistently since leaving Germany, a stable enough setting in which to refine the ideas that had been accumulating in him for nearly 2 decades by this point, the enduring tension between reason and revelation, the growing suspicion that modern philosophy had lost something the ancient world once understood clearly and had since forgotten, the emerging conviction that persecuted thinkers throughout history might have written more carefully and more deceptively than their readers had ever assumed while reading them at face value. His classes were demanding, sometimes exhaustingly so for the students who attended them, and his following, while still modest in size during these years, was intensely devoted, drawn less by any personal charisma on his part than by the unmistakable sense that they were sitting in the presence of a mind unwilling to settle for easy or comfortable answers to hard questions. His reading during these years ranged widely across ancient and medieval sources, and it was here, at the new school, that he began the sustained engagement with classical political philosophy that would eventually distinguish his work from nearly everyone else writing in his field. Colleagues who encountered him during this period recalled a scholar unusually resistant to intellectual fashion, uninterested in whatever approach happened to be gaining favor in a given department, and instead committed to a small number of difficult questions he intended to pursue as far as they would go, regardless of how unfashionable the pursuit might appear to others around him. He was, by every outward appearance, simply one more European scholar rebuilding a modest career in an adopted country, entirely unremarkable to anyone passing him on a New York street on any given afternoon, indistinguishable from 100 other émigrés doing the same. Inwardly, he was assembling the argument that would eventually define the remainder of his career and, in time, generate more controversy than anything else he would ever write or teach in a classroom. The pieces had been gathering for years by this point in his life. The early loss of faith back in Kirchheim, the confrontation with Heidegger's radical questioning in Freiburg, the patient study of Jacobi's skepticism under Cassirer, the long private meditation on how a person survives, intellectually and otherwise, in a world often openly hostile to their deepest convictions. He had spent 2 decades circling one central question without ever fully answering it to his own satisfaction, through 3 countries and as many languages. He was about to give that question a shape so specific and so provocative that it would outlast him by more than half a century, reaching readers and critics who had not yet even been born. Strauss rereads a medieval philosophical text late one night in his study, and for the first time in years of study, he notices something he had passed over before, a contradiction placed too carefully to be an accident. By the early 1950s, Strauss had spent years accumulating a suspicion that would, in 1952, become the argument for which he remains best known and most contested. He had noticed, across a range of philosophers writing under conditions of religious or political constraint, medieval Jewish and Islamic thinkers among them, a peculiar pattern: careful contradictions, buried qualifications, arguments that seemed to say one thing on the surface, while quietly undermining that same claim a few pages later, for a reader patient enough to notice. He had once read these as errors, the ordinary slips of authors working across centuries and languages. He began to read them instead as a method. The argument, when he finally published it as Persecution and the Art of Writing, was this: philosophers who lived under the threat of persecution, whether from religious authority or political power, could not always say plainly what they believed. To do so risked exile, imprisonment, or worse, not only for themselves but sometimes for the society unprepared to receive dangerous truths without disorder. And so they wrote on 2 levels at once: an exoteric surface, conventional, reassuring, acceptable to the censor and the casual reader, and beneath it, an esoteric teaching, visible only to a reader willing to notice contradiction, disproportion, and the strange silences where an argument seemed to stop short of its own logical conclusion. This was not, in Strauss's telling, evidence of confusion or cowardice on the part of these philosophers. It was, if anything, a demonstration of their seriousness, a discipline that protected both the philosopher and the community from truths that could unsettle a shared way of life before that community was ready to absorb them. Reading a persecuted philosopher properly meant reading twice, once for what was said, and once for what the manner of saying it revealed, the omissions as significant as the statements, the disproportion between a claim's importance and the brevity with which it was treated, a signal worth pausing over. The examples Strauss drew on were specific and carefully chosen. He pointed to medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophers writing within religious communities that could not always tolerate open philosophical inquiry, thinkers who needed a way to pursue reason's most demanding questions without appearing to challenge the revealed law that governed the societies they lived within. A philosopher in such circumstances could not simply announce a conclusion that appeared to contradict scripture. He needed a way to communicate that conclusion to the rare reader capable of following a difficult argument, while leaving the ordinary reader with a text that appeared perfectly orthodox on its surface. Strauss did not present this as a cynical technique, a mere trick for evading censorship. He presented it as a serious ethical discipline in its own right, one that took seriously both the philosopher's obligation to pursue truth without compromise and his obligation not to unsettle, carelessly, a community's shared way of life before that community had any means of absorbing the disturbance. Reading esoterically, in Strauss's account, was not a matter of decoding a simple cipher. It required patience, a willingness to notice when an argument grew strangely brief, exactly where the reader expected elaboration, or when a writer buried his most important qualification in a subordinate clause rather than a main one, small signals that, taken together, could reveal an entirely different teaching than the one stated on the surface. The thesis reshaped how an entire generation of scholars approached older texts, teaching them to look for the seam where a careful writer had joined two arguments that did not quite agree, and to ask why. It gave Strauss's students a method as much as a set of conclusions, a way of reading that could, in principle, be applied to any thinker who had ever written under constraint, in any century, in any language, from Plato writing under the shadow of Socrates' execution to Spinoza excommunicated from his own community for views he never stated with complete directness. And it raised, almost immediately, an uncomfortable question that Strauss himself never addressed directly in his published work. He had spent a career writing during an era hostile, in various ways, to his own convictions, first in a Germany that had turned against Jewish scholars entirely, and later within an American academy not always welcoming to arguments as unfashionable as his. If persecuted philosophers wrote esoterically to protect themselves and their societies, what reason was there to assume Strauss himself had written any differently? His own books, dense with qualification, careful in their omissions, precise in what they declined to state outright, could no longer be read as simple, transparent argument by anyone who had taken his own thesis seriously. Colleagues who worked alongside him during these years noticed that Strauss rarely, if ever, addressed this implication of his own thesis directly, even when students raised it in seminar. He would answer such questions, when pressed, with further questions of his own, redirecting attention back to the text under discussion rather than to his own methods or motives. Whether this reflected genuine modesty about a question he considered unanswerable, or something closer to the very discipline he had spent a career describing in others, no colleague who observed it could say with real confidence, and Strauss offered nothing in his own writing to settle the matter one way or the other. This explains what had seemed inexplicable to some of his most careful readers in later years, the sense that Strauss's books said less on the surface than they clearly meant, that his silences carried as much weight as his statements. Whether this was deliberate concealment on his part, or simply the caution of a scholar who had lived through what he had lived through, No one, including his closest students, could say with any real confidence. If Strauss was right about every philosopher before him, then his own books could no longer be read innocently either, and the question of what he had chosen not to say plainly would follow him for the rest of his career, and long after it. Strauss stands before a chalkboard in a quiet seminar room, drawing two circles that never quite overlap, one labeled in his own mind reason, the other revelation, and he studies the gap between them without speaking for a long moment. Out of decades of reading, teaching, and private reflection, Strauss arrived at the mature formulation of the tension he had first felt as a teenager losing his faith in Kirchheim. He called it, following an old figure of speech, the quarrel between Athens and Jerusalem, the irreconcilable rivalry between philosophy's claim that reason alone could discover how a human being ought to live, and revelation's claim that only obedience to a truth beyond reason's reach could ground a genuinely good life. Neither side, in Strauss's reading, could refute the other on its own terms. Philosophy could not prove that a life devoted to revealed faith was mistaken, because revelation did not stake its claim on the kind of proof philosophy demanded, and faith could not persuade a genuine philosopher to abandon reason's authority, because doing so would mean abandoning philosophy itself. This was not, for Strauss, a comfortable relativism in which both sides simply agreed to differ. It was a permanent, unresolved tension that he believed had shaped the entire history of Western thought, whether or not any given thinker acknowledged it openly. Every serious philosophical position, in his account, was implicitly a wager against revelation's claim, and every serious religious position was implicitly a wager against reason's sufficiency. The most honest thinkers, he argued, were the ones who recognized this quarrel rather than papering over it with false synthesis, and it was precisely this honesty that had grown rare in modern philosophy, which increasingly treated the question as settled, either by dismissing revelation outright or by domesticating it into something reason could safely absorb. Strauss traced this quarrel across the entire span of the tradition he had spent decades studying. He found it in Maimonides, who wrote as both a rabbinic authority and a philosopher trained in the Aristotelian tradition, careful never to let one commitment simply dissolve into the other. He found it in Plato, whose dialogues staged philosophy's own trial before the city that would eventually execute Socrates for the crime of questioning too openly. And he found it, closer to home, in his own adolescent crisis, the candle-lit reading that had first shown him that the household faith he had inherited could not simply out-argue the doubts forming in him, nor could those doubts simply dissolve the faith without leaving something unaccounted for. Strauss's own answer, if he gave one at all, was characteristically indirect. He did not resolve the quarrel. He insisted, instead, that living seriously within it, refusing the comfort of a false reconciliation, was itself the mark of a genuine thinker. This was the formalized adult version of the very question that had driven him from his father's synagogue as a teenager, the question of whether reason alone was sufficient, now transformed from personal crisis into rigorous philosophical architecture, tested against Plato and Maimonides, against Aristotle and the prophets, rather than against his own household alone. He had found no answer capable of dissolving the tension between reason and revelation once and for all. He had only found the intellectual courage, developed over 3 decades of reading and displacement, to say plainly that no such answer existed, and that anyone claiming otherwise had simply stopped looking closely enough at the difficulty. The boy who lost his faith in a Hessian synagogue had spent his entire life turning that private, adolescent loss into the central and unresolved question of an entire philosophical tradition. Colleagues who debated this formulation with him often came away less certain of their own settled positions than they had been going in, a discomfort Strauss seemed to regard as evidence the argument was working rather than failing. He offered no consolation to those who wanted philosophy to simply defeat revelation, and none to those who wanted revelation to simply humble philosophy. Both sides of any given debate, in his experience, tended to leave his seminar room having gained a clearer sense of what they could not prove, rather than a stronger version of what they already believed. He had found no answer to reconcile the two. He had only found the courage to say so clearly, and that courage would carry a cost among colleagues who preferred their philosophy without the quarrel left so visibly open. Strauss delivers a lecture in a packed hall at the University of Chicago, the audience unaccustomed to material this demanding, delivered with such unhurried calm, and several in the front rows lean forward as though afraid to miss a single clause. In 1953, Strauss published Natural Right and History, drawn from a series of lectures he had delivered at the University of Chicago, and the book delivered a direct challenge to an assumption that had become, by that point, almost invisible in its ubiquity across the American social sciences, the assumption that all moral and political standards were simply products of their historical moment, valid for their time and place, but possessing no claim to truth beyond it. This was historicism, the doctrine that had quietly replaced older beliefs in a fixed human nature or an unchanging natural right, and Strauss set out to demonstrate that it could not, in the end, sustain itself on its own terms. His argument proceeded with the same patient method he had used against Schmitt decades earlier. He did not simply assert that historicism was wrong. He traced its intellectual origins, showed how it had emerged from a series of specific philosophical choices rather than from any neutral, value-free observation of history, and then demonstrated that historicism, applied consistently to itself, undermined its own claim to be more than merely one more product of its era, no more binding than the standards it claimed to relativize. If all values were merely historical, then historicism's own values were merely historical too, with no special authority to displace the older tradition it had replaced. Strauss traced this development across several generations of German and European thought, showing how each step away from the classical belief in a fixed human nature had seemed reasonable, even modest, at the time it was taken, and how the cumulative effect of these small, reasonable steps had left the social sciences without any standard at all by which to distinguish a just arrangement from an unjust one, beyond the bare fact of which arrangement happened to prevail in a given century. He treated this not as a simple intellectual error, but as a genuine crisis, one that had left an entire discipline unable to say, on its own terms, why a tyranny was worse than a republic, beyond noting that the two were different. Strauss argued instead for the recovery of an older idea, largely abandoned by his contemporaries, that certain standards of right and wrong existed independent of any particular historical arrangement, discoverable through reason and reflection on human nature rather than handed down by convention or by the accidents of a given century. This was not a return to naive certainty. Strauss was careful throughout the book to show how difficult and contested the classical natural right tradition had always been, even in antiquity, citing the disagreements among the ancients themselves as evidence that the question had never been simple, only worth asking with total seriousness. But he insisted the difficulty of a question was no argument for abandoning it, particularly when abandoning it left a discipline with no standard at all by which to judge one arrangement more just than another. The book was received, in some quarters, as a serious and overdue corrective to a discipline that had drifted into a comfortable relativism it rarely examined. In others, it was received as an attack on the entire methodological foundation of modern social science, an accusation that an entire generation of scholars had mistaken intellectual humility for something closer to moral abdication. Strauss did not soften the charge in later editions or public remarks. He had built his argument to withstand exactly this reaction, tracing every objection back to its root before the book's critics could raise it. The debate the book provoked did not fade quickly. Departments across the country found themselves divided between scholars who considered Strauss's challenge overdue and scholars who considered it a dangerous invitation to dogmatism dressed up as classical scholarship. Strauss himself rarely engaged these disputes directly in public forums, preferring to let the argument stand as written and allowing his critics to respond to the book rather than to any further clarification from its author. He had accused an entire generation of scholars of moral cowardice, dressed as objectivity, delivered not as polemic, but as patient argument, page after careful page. Not everyone would forgive him for it, and the disagreement it provoked would follow him, in one form or another, for the remainder of his career. Two old friends exchange letters across an ocean, one in Chicago defending philosophy's independence from power, the other in Paris insisting that the philosopher must, sooner or later, choose a side. Among the most sustained intellectual relationships of Strauss's career was his friendship and public disagreement with Alexandre Kojève, a philosopher whose influential readings of Hegel had shaped an entire generation of French thought. The two men had known each other since their student years, and their friendship survived a disagreement serious enough to fill a published exchange, a debate, conducted largely through Strauss's study of Xenophon's dialogue on tyranny, over what role the philosopher ought to play in relation to political power. Xenophon's dialogue staged an exchange between a poet and a tyrant, and Strauss used his commentary on it to argue that the philosopher's proper stance toward rulers was one of careful distance, offering counsel where possible, but never becoming an instrument of the ruler's ambition, and never mistaking proximity to power for genuine influence over it. Kojève read the same dialogue differently, arguing that history itself was moving inexorably toward a universal and homogeneous state, and that the philosopher who refused any role in shaping that outcome was abdicating a responsibility history had placed before him, whatever discomfort came with accepting it. The published exchange between the two men ran to considerable length, each rereading the other's argument with total seriousness, rather than dismissing it as merely a difference in temperament or political taste. Strauss pressed Kojève on whether a philosopher who entered government service could ever fully trust that his counsel had not simply become an instrument of the ruler's pre-existing ambitions, dressed up afterward as wisdom. Kojève pressed Strauss in turn on whether a philosophy that refused all practical engagement with power was not simply choosing irrelevance, however dignified that irrelevance might feel from within a quiet study. The disagreement was not merely academic to either man. Kojève, who had spent years working within the French civil service after his purely philosophical writing had largely ceased, embodied in his own life the position he defended in argument, that the thinking man belonged, eventually, inside the machinery of power rather than at a safe remove from it. Strauss, who had spent his career deliberately outside any comparable institutional power, embodied the opposite conviction just as completely, that philosophy's value depended precisely on its refusal to become an instrument of any regime, however well-intentioned that regime believed itself to be. Neither man persuaded the other, and their correspondence over the years that followed showed two minds returning again and again to the same disagreement, without ever quite closing the distance between them. This explains what had seemed inexplicable to some of Strauss's students who encountered the exchange only in its published form, that two philosophers so plainly respectful of each other's intelligence could disagree so completely and so permanently on a question neither considered small. What made the friendship endure despite the disagreement was, by the account of those who knew both men, a shared conviction that the question itself mattered more than winning it. Neither Strauss nor Kojève treated the other's position as unserious or beneath engagement, and their letters, exchanged across an ocean over many years, showed two minds testing an argument against each other with a rigor neither could easily find among less demanding correspondents. Each remained, by all accounts, genuinely curious about how the other would respond to a new formulation of the same old disagreement, decade after decade, never quite tiring of a debate that refused to resolve. Strauss believed the philosopher must never rule, and must be wary even of counseling those who did. Within a generation, some of his own students, entering government and policy in ways Strauss himself never had, would face the very question he had spent a published debate insisting they should answer with caution. In a crowded seminar room at the University of Chicago, students arrive early to secure seats for a professor who never raises his voice and who somehow commands more attention through quiet precision than any lecturer they have heard raise one. Strauss arrived at the University of Chicago in 1949, and it was here, over the 2 decades that followed, that he built the following for which he would eventually become most widely known and most widely argued about. His students did not simply absorb his conclusions, they absorbed his method, the discipline of reading a text as though every choice the author made, every omission, every disproportion between a claim's importance and the space given to it, was potentially significant and worth interrogating rather than passing over. This method produced an unusually devoted circle of students, drawn from a range of backgrounds and later scattered across a range of careers, some remaining within the academy and others moving into government, journalism, and public life. What united them was less a shared political position, whatever critics would later claim, than a shared way of approaching old books, a conviction that the great texts of the philosophical tradition rewarded a patience and suspicion that most modern scholarship had abandoned. Strauss's seminar sessions ran for hours at a stretch, devoted often to a single paragraph of a single ancient text, worked over sentence by sentence, until every apparent inconsistency had been accounted for or acknowledged as genuinely unresolved. Students who came expecting a survey course found instead something closer to an apprenticeship, a slow transmission of a way of reading that could not be summarized in a lecture, but only demonstrated, week after week, text after text, until it became second nature to those who stayed with it. Visitors to these seminars sometimes remarked on how little Strauss seemed to perform for his audience, in an academic culture that increasingly rewarded exactly this kind of performance. He posed questions and waited, often for uncomfortably long stretches, for a student to work through the difficulty rather than supplying the answer himself. Colleagues at other institutions, accustomed to livelier lecture styles, occasionally found his classroom almost severe in its patience. His students, by contrast, tended to describe these same long silences as the moments when the real teaching was happening, the professor refusing to shortcut a difficulty his students needed to sit inside for themselves. Strauss himself remained, by every account from those years, a private and largely apolitical figure in his personal habits, uninterested in the machinery of academic politics, and famously reluctant to comment publicly on the pressing political controversies of his American years. He taught, he wrote, he returned, semester after semester, to the same handful of ancient and early modern texts, finding in each new reading something his students had not noticed before, and teaching them, in turn, to notice it themselves. He taught his students to read between the lines of every philosopher who came before him. He could not and did not attempt to control what his own students would eventually write there themselves, once his classroom years had ended and their own careers had begun in earnest. The seminar room, for all its quiet discipline, was already producing something Strauss himself could observe only from the front of the room, never fully from the outside. Strauss annotates a worn copy of The Prince late into the evening, treating its author not as the simple cynic generations of readers had assumed, but as something considerably more unsettling, an entirely honest man. In 1958, Strauss published Thoughts on Machiavelli, a study that applied his method of careful, suspicious reading to one of the most notorious texts in the Western tradition. Machiavelli had long been dismissed or celebrated as an amoral technician of power, a writer who had simply described politics as it actually operated rather than as moralists wished it to operate. Strauss argued this reading badly underestimated what Machiavelli had actually done. Machiavelli was not merely describing an amoral world. He was proposing, carefully and with full awareness of how radical the proposal was, an entirely new foundation for political life, one that abandoned the classical and Christian tradition's insistence that politics be judged against a standard of virtue existing independent of success. Strauss called Machiavelli, provocatively, a teacher of evil, not because Machiavelli lacked sophistication, but because Strauss believed Machiavelli understood with total clarity what he was recommending, and recommended it anyway, a deliberate rejection of the older tradition rather than an innocent oversight. This was, in Strauss's account, the true break represented by Machiavelli, more consequential than any single piece of practical advice found in The Prince, a break that had, over the centuries since, quietly reshaped how an entire civilization thought about the relationship between power and virtue. Strauss read Machiavelli's other major work alongside The Prince, tracing the same radical break across both texts and showing how consistently Machiavelli had pursued his departure from the classical tradition, rather than treating the prince as an isolated or uncharacteristic provocation. The consistency, for Strauss, was itself evidence against the reading of Machiavelli as a mere cynic offering scattered practical advice. A cynic did not need this much philosophical architecture to justify abandoning virtue as a standard. Only a serious thinker, aware of exactly what the older tradition had claimed and precisely what he was discarding, would go to such lengths to construct an alternative foundation in its place. Strauss devoted particular attention to the structure of Machiavelli's arguments, the deliberate ordering of chapters, the careful placement of qualifications that seemed, on the surface, to soften a claim while actually reinforcing it for the attentive reader. This was the same method of reading Strauss had developed for persecuted philosophers writing under religious constraint, applied now to a writer facing a different kind of danger entirely, the danger of proposing something so thoroughly at odds with received wisdom that plain statement risked dismissal rather than persecution. The book demonstrated Strauss's method applied at its most demanding, treating a text most scholars approached as settled, and finding within it a radicalism its casual readers had missed entirely. It was not an easy book, and it was not warmly received by every reader who encountered it, some objecting that Strauss had made Machiavelli into something darker and more deliberate than the historical record could support. Strauss did not retreat from the charge. He had built the argument from Machiavelli's own words, read with the same patience he had applied to Schmitt decades before. He had spent much of his career defending philosophy's proper distance from power. Now he was explaining, in exacting and unsettling detail, exactly how one Renaissance writer had closed that distance forever, and had done so, in Strauss's reading, with his eyes fully open to what he was doing. The book left readers with an uncomfortable question of their own, one Strauss never answered directly. If a thinker as clear-sighted as Machiavelli could choose, deliberately, to abandon the older standard of virtue, what confidence could anyone have that the standard itself, once abandoned, could ever be fully recovered? Strauss, visibly older now, gives what several of his students would later recall as among his most demanding lecture series, moving in a single afternoon from Thucydides to Plato to Aristotle, as though the three belonged, without strain, to a single continuous conversation. In 1964, Strauss published The City and Man, a work that gathered together, in a single synthesis, the classical readings he had spent decades developing separately across his teaching and earlier books. The work examined Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, Plato's Republic, and Aristotle's political philosophy, treating each not as an isolated monument, but as part of a continuous ancient inquiry into the nature of the political community and the proper relationship between the philosopher and the city that housed him, tolerated him, or, in Socrates' case, ultimately condemned him. The book represented, in many respects, the mature culmination of everything Strauss had built across the preceding decades. The suspicion of modern rationalism inherited from his encounter with Heidegger, the recovery of classical natural right, argued in his earlier book, the careful reading method developed through his study of persecuted philosophers, and the enduring question of the philosopher's relationship to political power that had occupied his long exchange with Koyave. Each thread, developed separately over 30 years, now appeared woven into a single sustained argument about what the ancients had understood and what modern political philosophy, in Strauss's persistent view, had largely forgotten or dismissed too quickly. The book's treatment of Thucydides drew particular attention from readers already familiar with Strauss's earlier work, since Strauss approached the historian not merely as a chronicler of the Peloponnesian War, but as a thinker whose narrative choices, his silences and emphases, carried the same kind of philosophical weight Strauss had spent decades teaching his students to notice in more overtly philosophical texts. The city and the man of the title were never treated as separate subjects. Each illuminated the other, the individual's pursuit of the good life, inseparable from the political community that made such a pursuit possible or impossible, depending on how that community was ordered. Reviewers noted the unusual demands the book placed on its readers, assuming a familiarity with three separate ancient authors, and the patience to follow arguments that moved fluidly between them without pausing to summarize. This was, by now, an established feature of Strauss's writing rather than an oversight, a deliberate refusal to simplify material he considered genuinely difficult for the sake of a wider readership he had never particularly sought to cultivate. Readers already familiar with Strauss's earlier work recognized in the book a summation rather than a departure, the clearest available statement of a project he had been building, one careful study at a time, since his earliest years in America. Few among them, including Strauss himself, could have fully anticipated how the students absorbing this synthesis in his Chicago seminar rooms would eventually carry it forward into arenas far removed from the quiet classical scholarship in which it had been developed. It was, in many respects, his summation, the clearest single statement of everything his career had been reaching toward since Marburg. He did not yet know it would also become, for better and for worse, something closer to scripture for the students who had sat in those rooms with him, quoted and reinterpreted by readers who would never sit in a Chicago seminar room themselves. A young student sits among a handful of others in a Chicago seminar room, absorbing a patient lecture on Xenophon, entirely unaware of where the habits of reading he is acquiring this afternoon will eventually lead him. Across his decades at Chicago, Strauss's classroom drew a wide and eventually consequential range of students, some of whom would go on to distinguished careers within the academy, and others who would carry the reading habits and philosophical convictions formed in his seminar rooms into government service, journalism, and public policy in the decades following his retirement. Among them were figures who would later become closely associated with the development of American conservative and neoconservative thought, though Strauss himself, during his teaching years, remained conspicuously uninvolved in the day-to-day political battles his students would eventually enter. The students who filled his seminar room in these years arrived for a wide range of reasons, some drawn by reputation alone, others by a specific interest in classical political philosophy that few other departments in the country were prepared to take as seriously as Strauss did. What they found, regardless of what had drawn them, was a professor uninterested in flattering their existing convictions and entirely willing to spend an entire session on a single sentence if the sentence warranted it. Some found this exhilarating, others found it exhausting. Nearly all of them, by later accounts, found it impossible to forget. Among the students passing through these years was a young man who would later become closely associated with American foreign policy debates decades afterward, sitting at this point simply as one more attentive face among many, absorbing a lecture on an ancient dialogue with no evident sign of where his own career would eventually lead him. Strauss, by every account, treated him as he treated any other serious student, judged by the quality of his questions rather than by any future significance no one in that room could have anticipated. What Strauss offered his students was never, by his own account or by the testimony of those who studied under him, a political program. It was a method of reading and a set of convictions about the enduring importance of the oldest philosophical questions, questions about justice, virtue, and the proper ordering of a political community, questions Strauss believed modern political science had too readily set aside in favor of narrower, more technical concerns. What his students did with that method, once they left his classroom and entered careers Strauss himself had never pursued, was a matter increasingly beyond his influence or control, a fact that seemed to trouble him less than it would later trouble his critics. The generation gathering in these seminar rooms during Strauss's final active years at Chicago could not have known, any more than Strauss himself could have known, how the ideas taking shape there would eventually be discussed, decades later, in rooms far removed from any university, by commentators debating whether a quiet professor of ancient philosophy had somehow shaped the foreign policy of a nation he had adopted as a refugee and never sought to govern himself. He believed he was teaching them how to read a text with patience and suspicion in equal measure. Decades later, long after these seminar rooms had emptied for the final time, the wider world would argue at length about what, precisely, his students had learned to do with that patience once they left his classroom behind. an argument Strauss himself would not live to see reach its fullest and loudest pitch. In a quiet faculty office at Chicago, Strauss reads through a student's paper late one afternoon, finding in it an interpretation of his own earlier writing that he had not quite intended, and does not fully correct. The very method Strauss had developed for reading persecuted philosophers, the assumption that a careful writer's silences and disproportions carried meaning beyond the literal surface of the text, was, inevitably, applied by his own students and later critics to Strauss's own considerable body of work. If Strauss believed every serious philosopher before him had written on two levels, exoteric and esoteric, there was no obvious reason his own students should refrain from asking what Strauss himself had chosen to leave unsaid, or said only in careful, deniable form, beneath the more conventional surface of his published arguments. It was, in a sense, the most natural extension imaginable of a method Strauss himself had spent decades teaching them to apply to every other thinker they encountered. The result, even within his lifetime, was a widening disagreement among his own closest students about what Strauss actually believed on questions he had never addressed with complete directness, disagreements that would only sharpen after his death, when the man himself was no longer available to clarify, correct, or simply decline to answer. Some read his caution as evidence of genuinely radical convictions hidden beneath a conventional surface for the protection of both the philosopher and a society not ready to receive them. Others read the same caution as nothing more than the ordinary reticence of a careful scholar, unwilling to overstate positions he considered genuinely difficult and unresolved. Students who studied directly under Strauss during these years recalled watching this disagreement take shape even in seminar, as different students drew different conclusions from the same lecture, each convinced their reading matched what the professor had genuinely intended, and each unable to produce anything beyond inference to settle the question. Strauss listened to these competing interpretations with what colleagues described as a kind of amused patience, rarely intervening to declare one reading correct and another mistaken, a habit some found maddening and others found entirely consistent with everything he had taught them about how a careful thinker ought to write. Some of his students argued privately that this refusal to settle the disagreement was itself a form of teaching, forcing them to sit with genuine uncertainty rather than accepting a convenient answer handed down from the professor's chair. Others found the same refusal simply frustrating, evidence that even Strauss's closest students could not always tell whether their teacher was demonstrating a philosophical point or simply declining, for reasons of his own, to clarify what he actually meant. Strauss, for his part, offered little public guidance on which reading was correct, a silence that, given his own thesis about persecuted writers, could itself be read either way, as confirmation of hidden depths or as simple scholarly restraint. He had, in effect, built a method so successful that it eventually turned back on its own author, consuming the certainty of his own students, even while he remained alive to witness the disagreement unfolding around him in the very seminar rooms where he had first taught the method to them. He had taught the world to distrust a philosopher's plain words, to search instead for what lay beneath them. He could hardly complain, in the years that remained to him, when his own students stopped trusting his plain words in exactly the same way, applying to their own teacher the very discipline he had spent decades training into them. An aging Strauss walks the quiet grounds of St. John's College in Annapolis, considerably smaller and quieter than the university he has left behind, and seems, by every account from those years, entirely at ease with the difference. In the years following his retirement from the University of Chicago, Strauss accepted a position at St. John's College in Annapolis, a small institution built around the sustained study of primary texts in intimate seminar settings rather than the large lecture format common elsewhere. It was, in many respects, a deliberate return to smaller scale, fewer students, closer engagement with the texts themselves, a homecoming to the kind of intensive close reading that had first drawn him to philosophy as a young man, before institutional size and academic reputation had accumulated around his name. Annapolis offered Strauss something Chicago, for all its prestige, could no longer easily provide: rooms small enough that every student could be drawn directly into the argument, rather than observing it from the back of a crowded lecture hall. Colleagues who visited him during these years described a man who seemed, if anything, more at ease than he had been at the height of his Chicago reputation, freed from the administrative demands of a large department and able to devote his remaining energy entirely to the texts themselves and the students working through them alongside him. The curriculum at St. John's, built entirely around close reading of primary texts across the whole of the Western tradition, suited Strauss's own method more naturally than any lecture-based department could have. Here, there was no need to translate his approach into an unfamiliar academic culture, as he had once had to do in England decades earlier. The institution itself had been built on a conviction not far removed from his own that the old books deserved to be read slowly, argued over, and taken with total seriousness rather than surveyed at a comfortable distance. The move surprised some observers who assumed a scholar of Strauss's stature and following would seek a larger, more prominent stage in his final active years. Those who knew him better recognized it instead as entirely consistent with everything that had defined his approach from the beginning, a preference for depth over breadth, for the patient interrogation of a single difficult text over the accumulation of institutional prestige. St. John's asked for exactly the kind of teaching Strauss had always done best, regardless of how many students filled the room. He had spent his life questioning whether reason alone was sufficient to guide a human life, a question that had first taken shape in him as a restless teenager in Hesse. He would spend his final years of active teaching, quietly, still asking the same question, in smaller rooms, before smaller classes, with no less seriousness than he had ever brought to it, the same discipline that had carried him from a farming town in Germany to faculties on 2 continents, now folded into a handful of quiet Maryland afternoons. A frail Strauss, his voice noticeably weaker than it once was, insists on finishing a seminar on a Platonic dialogue rather than cutting the session short, despite a colleague's quiet suggestion that he rest. In his final years, Strauss's health declined steadily, though it did little, by every surviving account, to diminish his insistence on continuing to teach for as long as he was physically able. Students and colleagues from this period remembered a man who arrived to every session prepared with the same thoroughness he had brought to his classroom decades earlier, unwilling to let failing strength shorten a discussion he considered unfinished, or to treat his own frailty as sufficient reason to abandon a text before its difficulties had been properly worked through with the students in front of him. Those who studied with him during these final years recalled sessions in which his voice grew faint enough that students leaned forward to catch every word, an inversion of the crowded Chicago lecture halls of decades earlier, now replaced by a handful of listeners gathered close around a table, following an argument delivered more slowly than it once had been, but with no less precision. He continued to insist, as he always had, that a text deserved to be finished properly rather than abandoned for the sake of convenience, his own condition included among the things not worth dwelling on when there was still a difficult passage left to work through together. There was, in this insistence, something consistent with everything that had defined him from his earliest years, an unwillingness to accept an easy resolution, whether to a philosophical question or to the simple, practical question of when a man ought to stop working. The devotion to the examined life that had carried